What is the price of 4,322 square kilometers of territory? Roughly 400,000 killed and wounded. That figure reflects Russia's total territorial gains throughout 2025, and the human losses suffered in that single year alone. In other words, for every square kilometer seized, Russia paid the price of nearly 100 killed or wounded, for land that amounts to less than 1% of Ukraine's pre-war territory. Since the beginning of the war, an estimated 1.2 to 1.5 million citizens of the Russian Federation, along with contracted mercenaries, have been killed or wounded on the Ukrainian steppes. Maps like this help us grasp the sheer scale of the land over which the war is being fought. They also show how extraordinarily costly it has become to pry even a single kilometer from the hands of the defenders, and how deeply the army directed from the Kremlin is being carved up in the process. Seen through the lens of time, we have now passed day 1400 of the war. In their selective reading of history, Russians conveniently sidestepped their collaboration with Nazi Germany. For Russia, the Second World War began on June 22, 1941, when the Third Reich launched Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union. Yet 1400 days later, the Russian textbook proudly states the first Soviet units were already on the outskirts of Berlin. By contrast, nearly 4 years after February 24, 2022, Russian forces are almost as far from Kyiv as they were 1400 days ago. This underscores a central truth. Although Russia has held the operational initiative for the past 2 years, it remains far from achieving the war's most basic objective. Even so, the Kremlin continues to bet that sustained pressure will eventually break Ukraine, that the front will collapse like a house of cards. Yet while the defenders' position has undeniably deteriorated, the empirical facts do not support this thesis. All the more so because 2025, while indeed the most difficult year for Ukraine, also marked the beginning of a sharp increase in the costs of war for the Russian Federation, driven in part by a sustained campaign of long-range strikes, a campaign that, notably, has not abated. Will 2026 finally bring the long-awaited peace? Let's examine this. The war between Russia and Ukraine has brutally exposed how fragile the modern global economy really is. A single round of sanctions, political decision, or an attack on infrastructure can shake energy, commodity, and currency markets within hours. It is a conflict that clearly shows that today, wars are fought not only on the battlefield, but also on financial charts. In this kind of reality, understanding economic mechanisms is no longer a luxury. It is a necessity. That is why I have been using XTB for years, an investment platform that helps me analyze global trends and make decisions based on data rather than emotions. With XTB, you get access to over 8,400 stocks and ETFs from markets around the world, commission-free up to 100,000 euros in monthly turnover. Above that, a standard 0.2% fee applies. In addition, XTB has prepared a free report for 2026, showing how geopolitics may affect the markets. Just download it from the link in the description and see what predictions you can translate into real investment decisions. Remember, every investment involves risk. Alongside the 4th anniversary of the war, the current moment is also defined by 1 full year of Donald Trump's presidency. To say that his return to the White House was decisive for the shape of war in 2025 would be a profound understatement. On December 30th, the New York Times published an investigative piece by Adam Entes, a text that can fairly be described as a chronicle of separation between Ukrainians and Americans. Entes bases his extensive account of relations between the two administrations over the past year on more than 300 interviews with senior officials from the security, military, and intelligence communities. Every one of them insisted on anonymity, fearing retaliation from Donald Trump. The article takes the reader behind the scenes of a widening rift, revealing a web of backstage frictions and internal reshuffles. In an age of ubiquitous information, the evolution of relations along the Trump-Zelensky line was visible to anyone paying attention. What N2S does, however, is systemize these developments, placing them into a coherent analytical frame. One theme emerges with particular clarity: the struggle between rival camps inside the Trump administration. In the so-called anti-Ukraine camp, a central figure is J.D. Vance, who from the outset showed little sympathy for the idea of supporting Ukraine, arguing instead that US priorities lay in Asia, the Middle East, and South America. His views were shaped to a significant degree by Elbridge Colby, another skeptic of the Ukrainian cause, who was later appointed Under-Secretary of Defense, with broad authority over the direction of foreign and defense policy. And yet the name that appears most frequently in N2's account is that of Pete Hegseth. Hegseth, described by the author as the least experienced among Trump's most prominent apostles, assumed the post of Secretary of Defense without a clearly defined position on either Ukraine or Russia. In fact, we'll find videos from 2022 showing Hegseth sharply condemning the Russian invasion. In 2025, however, he evolved into one of the administration's leading anti-Ukraine hawks. This camp also includes Andy Diskrol, a close associate of Vance, Jared Kushner, and Steve Witkoff, figures known for their close ties to Kremlin's emissary Kirill Dmitriev. Less well known, but arguably more intriguing, is the story of those who continued to back the Ukrainian cause. 80-year-old Keith Kellogg, the US Special Envoy for Ukraine, emerges as a man walking a razor-thin line. On the one hand, he sought to keep Ukrainian interests on Trump's radar. On the other, he operated in a deeply hostile environment, with many inside the administration waiting for him to stumble. At one point, according to the author, Trump reportedly referred to Kellogg as an idiot. Another quiet protagonist of the Ukrainian cause is Christopher Cavoli, the commander of US forces in Europe, and the key coordinator of American military assistance to Ukraine. His direct superior was then Hegseth. Time and again, Cavoli sent emails to the Pentagon, urging that aid be unblocked and intensified, and thus he came close to paying for his pro-Ukrainian stance with early dismissal. More broadly, the US military as an institution largely sided with Ukraine, and many officers paid the price for it. Numerous generals, unnamed in the article, lost their positions. One of them was Charles Q. Brown Jr., who was dismissed in February. But while the Department of Defense often pushed ahead of the political line, most notably when Hegseth suspended deliveries to Ukraine without Trump's authorization, another powerful American institution worked to counterbalance this de facto abandonment of Ukraine. That institution was the Central Intelligence Agency. As the article notes, quote, "Where Mr. Hegseth had marginalized his Ukraine-supporting generals, the CIA director, Mr. Ratcliffe, had consistently protected his own officers' efforts for Ukraine. He kept the agency's presence in the country at full strength. Funding for its programs there even increased." Unquote. It was on the basis of CIA-provided intelligence support that Ukraine was able to expand its long-range strike campaign. Here the text offers some details. CIA experts reportedly helped identify the Achilles heels of Russian refineries, those elements of infrastructure that are hardest to replace or repair, whose destruction can shut a facility down for weeks or even months. According to the CIA, the daily cost of Ukrainian strikes on Russian refineries rose to as much as $75 million per day. The agency was also said to have assisted operations targeting Russia's shadow fleet. These attacks, notably, are still ongoing, a point we will return to shortly. And Trump himself? Those familiar with the subject will not be surprised by sources who describe the president's worldview in blunt terms. Trump's views and decisions were usually shaped by the last person he spoke to, or by the last thing that caught his eye on Fox News. In N2's portrayal, Trump emerges as erratic, inclined to side with whomever he perceives as stronger. This, the author suggests, helps explain his illogical attempts to appease Vladimir Putin, as well as his hostility toward Volodymyr Zelensky, whom he reportedly once referred to as a, quote, motherfucker. The article also provides fascinating behind-the-scenes details of the talks held in Jeddah on March 11th, where American and Ukrainian delegations met. During those discussions, Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, reportedly asked the Ukrainians to define their absolute red lines. My quotes, then serving as National Security Advisor, then handed Rustem Umerov a blue highlighter, slid a map of Ukraine across the table, and told him, start drawing. Umerov, then Ukraine's defense minister, first traced Ukraine's northern border with Russia, and then drew a line across Ukrainian territory along the March line of contact, cutting through Kharkiv, Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions. Moving through Zaporizhia, he marked the nuclear power plant as Ukrainian territory. In the Kherson region, he extended the line to include the Kinburn Spit as part of Ukraine. Control over this area, he argued, would ensure unimpeded access for Ukrainian vessels to Mykolaiv. This was likely the first such explicit acknowledgement of readiness to cede territory. Quote, one American official recalled, "It was the first time that Zelensky, through his people, said, in order to reach peace, I'm willing to give up 20% of my country." So reads the account in the text. The prospect of a swift peace has hovered over the conflict since the very beginning of Donald Trump's inauguration, and even earlier, during the election campaign of the 79-year-old president. As Enthus notes, Trump promised at least 83 times to end the war within a single day. He didn't do so in one day, nor by all indications, he will do so in 1 year. Trump wants to secure his place in history as the man who halted the largest armed conflict in Europe since World War II. A feat, he hopes, would culminate in a Nobel Peace Prize. Yet success if peace plans continue to dissolve into quasi-diplomatic chatter, which is precisely the outcome Moscow desires. Russia has no interest in ending this war, and so the show goes on. And if the show continues, Ukrainians have no intention of remaining passive actors. The strike campaign against Russia continues, and continues to evolve. Explosions are being heard with increasing frequency inside Moscow itself. According to data released by the Russian Ministry of Defense, Ukraine, at least until January 5th, attacked Moscow every single day of 2026. On Sunday, January 4th alone, Russian air defenses reportedly destroyed 57 drones over Moscow and 437 across the Russian Federation as a whole. Does this mean Kyiv is easing off strikes against refineries? Quite the opposite. While December saw a slight decline in Ukrainian attacks on Russian refineries taken in isolation, once a full spectrum of operations is considered, major strikes on refineries, maritime infrastructure, tankers and pipeline networks, December was in fact a record month. According to data compiled by Bloomberg, there were at least 24 such strikes in December alone. Refineries hit included those in Ryazan, Volgograd, Tuapse, Syzran, Sławiańsk and Nowoszachtinsk, the latter reportedly forced to shut down. The consequences are visible in Russia's public finances. As a result of Ukrainian strikes, Russian budget revenues from petroleum products fell by roughly 1/3 year-on-year, mirroring estimates of refinery capacity taken offline. According to Bloomberg calculations, based on data from the Russian Ministry of Finance, published in early December, oil-related tax revenues fell by 32% in November, to 414 billion rubles. Total oil and gas revenues declined by 34% to 530 billion rubles. Which means one thing: pressure on the Russian economy is not easing, it is intensifying. Among the many indicators that support this assessment, this chart is particularly revealing. The green line represents liquidity in Russia's banking system, while the blue line, so-called repo operations, show how much banks are borrowing from the Central Bank of Russia against collateral. Falling liquidity means that banks are finding it increasingly difficult to finance themselves on the open market. Repo operations, by contrast, are an emergency funding channel provided by the central bank. The fact that these two lines are diverging is a clear warning sign. Banks either do not trust one another, or there is a growing shortage of real money in the system. What is more, Russian banks have already received 850 billion rubles from the National Wealth Fund of Russia. The situation is further aggravated by the state of Russian oil exports. Not only is less oil reaching the market due to Ukrainian strikes, but what does get sold is traded at a deep discount. By the end of December, the price of Russian crude reportedly fell to as low as $33 per barrel. The Kremlin tries to stabilize the situation through a continuous sell-off of government bonds. Even so, the amount of free money circulating in the economy continues to shrink, while Russians are withdrawing ever larger amounts of cash from ATMs. Meanwhile, domestic consumption is steadily declining, and in real terms, once inflation is taken into account, it has already turned negative. The impact is being felt across virtually all industrial sectors. Yevgen Istrebin, who closely monitors the condition of the Russian economy, reports that the country is experiencing a state of generalized industrial collapse. Pumps minus 38% year-on-year, cars minus 34%, tractors minus 61%, rail cars minus 44%. The conclusions remain consistent with what we argued 6 months ago. Russia and its economy are undergoing a process of uncontrolled internal degradation. What remains unknown is the critical threshold, the moment at which the entire structure either collapses or becomes fundamentally dysfunctional. Financial engineering, a wartime economic regime, and crucially, public acceptance all help explain why, despite immense economic pressure, the Kremlin believes it can still drive the country toward total victory over Ukraine, especially if Europe and the United States scale back their involvement. This is a full wartime strategy, subordinating every aspect of the country's functioning to a single objective: military success. If Russia is preparing for a long war of attrition against Ukraine, then Ukraine, in turn, is preparing for a long struggle for survival. Its economy, left to fend for itself, would be unable to withstand a challenge of this magnitude. That is why Kyiv is critically dependent on external financial assistance. This fact becomes all the more important given that since Donald Trump returned to power, Europe alone has shouldered the financial burden of keeping Ukraine functioning. Europe, despite its political lethargy, understands what is at stake. Yet once again, it has failed to generate the internal consensus required to transfer to Ukraine the frozen assets of the aggressor state, Russia. On Friday, December 19th, leaders of the European Union agreed to jointly lend Ukraine 90 billion euros, interest-free, to ensure that Kyiv could continue financing its defense against Russian imperialism. This, however, was Plan B. Despite repeated efforts, Plan A, using frozen Russian assets for this purpose, did not materialize. EU leaders had been working on a so-called reparations loan, but the proposal was blocked by Belgium, where most of the assets are held. Brussels demanded guarantees against potential financial and legal claims that could arise from such a move. Under the current arrangement, Ukraine is to repay the loan once it receives war reparations. If no reparations are paid, the Russian assets will remain frozen, a mechanism that in itself creates pressure for any future peace settlement to include explicit provisions for reparations to Ukraine. To underpin these efforts, a new body has recently been established in The Hague, the International Commission for Reparations for Ukraine, tasked with collecting and systematizing documentation of the destruction caused by Russian aggression. The adaptation of a long-term thinking is also visible in cabinet reshuffles. The new year has brought significant personnel changes within the administration of Volodymyr Zelensky. Replacing Andriy Yermak, until recently Zelensky's right-hand man as the head of the presidential office, is Kyrylo Budanov, a figure with high approval ratings and strong public support, and until recently, the head of Ukraine's military intelligence agency. Meanwhile, the post of Minister of Defense, vacated by Denis Shmyhal, who moved to the Energy Department, has been taken over by Mikhailo Fedorov, formerly Deputy Prime Minister for Digital Transformation. A young technocrat, Fedorov is the architect of Ukraine's digitalization drive and the dronification of the battlefield, and the author of the Army of Drones project. According to Daniel Szeligovsky of PISM, Ukraine's frequent personnel rotations are no coincidence. President Zelensky places personal leadership over institutions, treating rotations as a tool to improve state performance, a natural response to evolving challenges and problems. Both Budanov and Fedorov maintain close ties with the CIA, which continues to operate robustly in Ukraine, arguably the last major American institution to do so at scale. Both men also enjoy positive public perception at home, and come to a degree from outside a rigid, ossified system. They are young, reform-minded, and crucially, they embody hope. Not all changes have been welcomed, however. Vasyl Maliuk, the head of Ukraine's Security Service, SBU, and the architect of several spectacular special operations, including Operation Spiderweb, attacks on the Crimean Bridge, and the development of maritime drone strike campaigns, has stepped down from his post. Maliuk was also associated with actions against anti-corruption bodies, NABU and SAPO, which were instrumental in bringing down Yermak. He is expected to remain within the SBU in a different capacity. The acting head of the SBU is now Yevhen Hmara, formerly the commander of Alpha. In addition, Zelensky appointed Chrystia Freeland, former Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, as an economic advisor. Despite these changes, the widely criticized Commander-in-Chief of Ukraine's Armed Forces, Oleksandr Syrsky, has retained his position. Does all this mean that a year from now, we will be still talking only about peace prospects? Despite a slow campaign of attrition on the front and the absence of agreement on peace terms, each passing month increases the pressure to end the fighting. Kyiv is prepared to stop the war immediately, even at the cost of significant territorial losses, de facto. It is Vladimir Putin, however, who refuses, betting that a breakthrough lies just around the corner. Yet Russia, despite its favored narrative of an unsinkable colossus, is facing mounting pressure. All signs suggest that whether it wants it or not, 2026 will force Moscow to sit down for real peace talks, without smoke and mirrors. In the meantime, further diplomatic meetings aimed at preparing the ground for that finale took place on Tuesday, this time under the banner of the Coalition of the Willing in Paris. Representatives of 35 countries participated, 27 at leader level. Paris also hosted what might be called Donald Trump's export duo, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. Did the talks deliver a breakthrough? No. But Europeans and Americans reportedly reaffirmed the need to provide Ukraine with hard security guarantees. As part of this, leaders adopted the Paris Declaration, a political commitment to deliver such guarantees. While not yet a full treaty, it reflects a shared determination among coalition members to act jointly for Ukraine's security. Once again, leaders spoke of readiness to establish an international corps that would be stationed in Ukraine after the war. Both France and the United Kingdom, through their leaders, expressed such willingness. This is, it bears recalling, a point explicitly contested by Russia. The Kremlin insists that any such force in Ukraine would become a legitimate military target. And so the war, like a pharmacist's scale, tilts first to one side and then to other. And yet it remains in a state of precarious balance, with no clear advantage for either camp. A year from now, will we still be discussing new strikes on Kyiv or Moscow? Or will we instead be asking whether a new peace truly and durably safeguards Ukraine's security architecture and that of Europe as a whole?